Hello, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Nur Alifiana Variviana, and on this occasion, I'll present the deconstruction analysis of the poem London by William Blake. So let's start with what is deconstruction? Deconstruction is a method of philosophical and literary analysis derived mainly from work of Jacques Derrida that question the fundamental conceptual distinction or opposition in Western philosophy through a close examination of the language and logics of philosophical and literary texts. This deconstruction theory says that there is never an absolute meaning of a word or sentence. It's all depends on the context and purpose of the sentence. The analysis using deconstruction theory aims to find a new meaning that may be hidden in the text. The deconstruction displays the opposition by showing that neither term is primary. So, what is opposition? Opposition is a product or construction of the text rather than something given independently of it. Today we will analyze from London by William Blake. So let's get know who is William Blake. William Blake is a poet, painter, engraver, and visionary. William Blake worked to bring about a change both in the social order and in the mind of man. The in his lifetime, his work was largely neglected or dismissed. He is now considered one of the leading lights of English poetry, and his work has only grown in popularity. London by William Blake. London is a poem by William Blake published in Song of Experience in 1794. It is one of the few poems in Song of Experience that doesn't have a corresponding poem in Song of Innocence. When you first read and analyze the poem, you may think that this poem is about the terrible and deplorable condition of the city of London and its inhabitants. The poem describes London as a gloomy and unforgiving place for its inhabitants. We can see throughout the poem that everyone in London is suffering. In binary opposition, we all know that the contradictory position of suffering is happiness, and happiness is the privileged thing. This binary opposition between suffering and happiness places happiness above suffering. Therefore, one can interpret this poem as a poem about the narrator who has the state of London, how London tortured, and how its inhabitants suffer. In a normal binary hierarchy, people tend to place suffering under happiness. People will do anything to avoid suffering. This poem explored the tension between suffering and happiness. By reading in general, you maybe will interpret this poem as the narrator's statement about how bad and cruel life in London is. However, upon closer and analytical reading using a deconstructive approach, we may see something else in this poem that challenges the binary position between suffering and happiness in this poem. This poem was written in 1794, which was in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, and Great Britain is considered by many to be the site of the first industrial revolution. London itself is a huge cosmopolitan city. We can see every aspect of life in London, from the poorest to the richest. Interestingly, the upper class is never mentioned as suffering like others, even though they also live in London. If we observe deeply, actually, all the suffering in this poem comes from the lower class. That is, if we refocus our attention on those who are not suffering, yeah, let's call it the upper class or bourgeois. This poem is not just about suffering anymore. In essence, this poem is not only about the individual experience of suffering, but also about how suffering is distributed. This new way of reading refers the original meaning we deduce from this poem. This poem is no longer about suffering itself, but also about happiness. A happiness promised by the Industrial Revolution, but never given to the poor. The constructive analysis gives us new meaning that this poem is not about the narrator insulting and hating London, but about how he longs for the happiness that never comes to his fellow citizens. Like in the third and fourth stanza, we can see that the supposed authority, like the nobility, the church, the generals, and the upper class, is the cause of all the misery of London. Not all of London suffers. As we can see, there the symbol of the nobility and the bourgeoisie is accent for all suffering in London. Also, in the fourth stanza, we see how young and innocent people turn into prostitutes to serve the upper classes. Their happiness comes from the suffering from others. The happiness is privileged as the result of people's sufferings. And there's also an acknowledged contradiction in this poem. This illustrates that the supposed ruler, who is responsible for everyone's welfare, is the one causing all this suffering. Therefore, suffering and happiness are related. One side maybe must suffer in order for the other to be happy. In conclusion, after we taking a deconstructive approach, we finally get some new ways to read and interpret this poem. We can conclude that this poem is not just about how the narrator describes London as a terrible place where the people suffer, but about why they suffer and the fact that contradict what is clearly described in every word of this poem. In addition, this poem can also be interpreted as a commentary on how exploitative and uncaring the upper classes and critics uh, about the impact of the Industrial Revolution. So yeah, that was my explanation, and I apologize if there are any some mistakes. Thank you for watching. See you at another time. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.